Good afternoon again. Thank you all for coming here today. And we thank our speakers as well. We are gathered here today to discuss some current issues and to provide you with an in-depth content on the current law enforcement mission that has been undertaken at the Tigray region. But before that, I would like to remind you that this is not an official briefing. This is specifically directed to give you an in-depth content on the situations, the historical background of TPLF and its political affiliation and activities for the past 40 years since its establishment. So again, I will remind you that this is not an official briefing, but you can specifically direct your questions while the discussion session is open for the speakers so that they can give you free of their own perspectives and thoughts on the matters that they will present as a paper. So as I have mentioned, before discussing that, understandable for you that the international media to seek background on the current situation and to seek factual content of the historical and political background. So we are here today with independent scholars. Two of them are here to give you briefings and perspectives of independent thoughts. And one speaker will give you briefing from the government side and the government stand on the political actions and law enforcement mission that has been undertaken. So the speakers here have a background of history, law, and political issues. They're here to give a holistic and perspective so that you can get an actual and fact-based information about the current situation. So before proceeding to the first order of business, let me just give you a very brief introduction of today's session. We will have three brief ideas. I'm not allowed to call them papers. They're just independent thoughts of the three speakers. They'll give you a brief introduction about what they will focus on today's session so that you can direct your specific questions towards them. Let me introduce you who they are. We have Mr. Ababaw Ayalew, we have Mr. Zadek Abraha, and we have Dr. Zawdneh Bayena. So the first speaker will be Mr. Ababaw Ayalew. He is an assistant professor of history at Addis Ababa University, and his speech will specifically focus on a glimpse of atrocities committed by the TPLF leadership from 1975 to 2000. So I'll leave the floor to you, Mr. Ababaw.
Good afternoon, everyone. And then also thank you for giving me this opportunity to reflect upon the current situation in an historical perspective. So as you know, since April 2018, Ethiopia is undergoing a process of reform, and that reform has brought about so many changes, principally widening the political space within the country, and then also bringing many changes which range from freeing political prisoners up to making peace with neighboring Eritrea. So within this span, a lot has been accomplished for the past 2.5 years. But all these changes had faced so many challenges. And some of the challenges, actually most of the challenges are predictable and then expected as what happens in a reform process. But something which is unexpected and then beyond imagination is what happened on the night of October 3 2020, and that is the attack of the various camps of the Northern Command of the Ethiopian Defense Forces. So this is an absolute act of lunacy and insanity, which had brought a lot of consequences for the TPLF, as well as which led us to the current situation. So what I will present here is not exactly what happened since October 3 and 4, 2020, rather what was the political behavior of the TPLF, and then since its establishment in 1975, what kind of reckless atrocities did the TPLF leadership commit at different times, at different places, on various communities of Ethiopia. So I will just mention examples to show the real and true character of this political group. So I must start who were the leadership of the TPLF. We can forget the rank and file of the party. But the leadership, as you know, in the early 1970s, Tigrayan students from the Haile Selassie First University started political discussions regarding their region, as well as the fate of the Ethiopian state. So within this process, what happened was two associations, a sort of associations emerged. One is the Political Association of Tigray, which included radical regional nationalists, and then the other is the Tigrayan University Students Association. They are not associations in the strict sense, but a sort of groups which made political discussions. So in 1974, some of them established what came to be known as the Tigrayan Liberation Front. And then in 1975, Marxist radicalists established the TPLF, Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. So as the atrocities of the TPLF starts from 1975. That atrocity was committed on their colleagues and then comrades. So the TPLF's first ruthless action was to liquidate the TLF, which was operating in some parts of Tigray, and that was done in a manner that was treacherous, and then also with executions. That was not the only thing. The TPLF always avoids discussions with other political parties. So in the late 1970s, two political groups were operating in the Tigray region. One is the Ethiopian Democratic Union, and then the other is the EPRP. So leaders of the TPLF, actually, they have intimacy with leaders of the EPRP, as well as the Ethiopian Democratic Union. So in 1976-78, TPLF liquidated EPRP, and then the last battle, the so-called Battle of Asimba, was not actually a battle. It was a massacre of most of the unarmed members of the EPRP, and then followed the EDU. These two incidents show, you see, TPLF from the very beginning does not have a culture of negotiation, and then also dealing with other political parties in a peaceful manner. 1985 again is an incident which tells us the true character of TPLF. In 1985, the TPLF made its first Congress, and then the Tigrayan Marxist-Leninist League was established. So with this political reform, the Adwa elite came to control the total leadership of the TPLF, and then what was known in history as the purge of 1985 started. So anybody who opposed the political leadership of the Adwa elite in the TPLF was purged. So that's why I say with this purge, almost more than 2,000 people within the ranks and files of the fighting force, and then also within the political rank were killed. Another thing again, which one can mention to show what the TPLF has been doing to civilians is the housing incidents which occurred on 22 June 1988. Historical sources on the bombing of housing actually come mostly from one source, and that is from the TPLF side, but living witnesses of the occurrence mostly tell us that the TPLF deliberately supplied false information for the Derg's army, and then as you see, what was captured, the image captured by cameras clearly shows that the TPLF deliberately set the event and then made the Derg to take action in order to mobilize the Tigrayan people, because that was a turning point in the history of the TPLF. Up to the incident of Hausen, TPLF's interest was to liberate Tigray, but by considering international situations as well as the weakening Derg, they wanted to proceed to the rest of Ethiopia, and then mobilizing the people was crucial at that time, but they used a very rude and merciless method to accomplish their objective. Then after takeover of power also, the TPLF did not change its strategy. The first thing is that you see the TPLF during the period of struggle as well as after the period of struggle strictly focused on a political agenda, a political program that orbited ethnicity and ethno-nationalism. So unlike the expectation of many Ethiopian political parties and groups, TPLF, after establishing the EPRDF, you see, it established its own hegemony and continued its policies by crafting a constitution that served its own purpose. So what were the atrocities that were committed after it took control of state power? To begin with, you see, it started summary executions. In the immediate aftermath of the capture of Addis Ababa, people were executed summarily by the pretext of stopping looting and other activities. Not only that, there are many, so to save time I have to, I think, go to more important and recent issues. The 2005 election also has shown the true characteristic of the TPLF. So following the election of 2005, there were opposition regarding the result of the election by the people of Addis Ababa and then also Amhara region and Oromia. So in 2006, an independent commission, which was established by the TPLF-led EPRDF, came up with a true report of 193 people killed in Addis Ababa only, and then 20,000 people arrested in various regions of the country. Next to the election, most of the atrocities done by EPRDF are between 2060 and 2080, to mention some. The first is the repression of Muslims who demanded that the government should not involve in religious affairs and also in religious institutions. So that protest by the Muslims led to a long struggle that led to the arrest of its leaders and then also repression by force in many places. From 2016 to 18, mostly the repression focused in Amhara region and then Oromia region. But the two tragic incidents were the Irecha incident, which took place in 2016, and then also the tragic incident in Bahar Dar, which led to the killing of unarmed civilians who were protesting the government in an early morning police action. After 2018, also the TPLF did not disengage itself from very terrible actions of inciting ethnic cleansing, and then also inciting and fueling ethnic conflicts. So one thing that it did since 1991 was provoking ethnic conflicts. Some of them are policy driven, some of them just to create distance and suspicions among competing ethnic groups. So that's why you see from 2018 onwards, provoking ethnic conflicts in many regions was one strategy. And then targeting higher institutions of learning to create chaos in different regions also was one thing that the TPLF has been following. Religious institutions also were used as instruments to create anarchy among the people. In many places, particularly Western Gondar and then Raya region and then Matakal region, these are places that the TPLF focused to create a dismemberment of the Ethiopian nation, which will favor to fulfill its objectives of creating an independent Tigrayan state. So what I can conclude is that, you see, currently when we talk about what happened on October 3 and 4, and then the attack and massacre of the Ethiopian Defense Forces, this is not something that came out of the blue. Rather, this is what the TPLF has been doing for the past 45 years since its establishment. And then also, this is a leadership that has not changed any of its political program, any of its policies regarding the Ethiopian nation, as well as internal reform also was objected. So the only time that an internal reform was attempted within the TPLF was in 1993 Ethiopian calendar, and that gave the opportunity for the Adwa group again to fully control the leadership by accusing the rest or the ones who pose the question as Bonapartists. So for me, the TPLF leadership, you see, with such a history and record of atrocities, did not play any constructive role for Ethiopia, while it controlled power, and then also after losing its hegemony over the EPRDF, and then after the retreat to Mekelle, it continued to still provoke different actions that will somehow challenge the reform process, and then also that will challenge the very existence of the Ethiopian state. So unless this leadership and then also the party is liquidated, still Ethiopia's sovereignty and then also the democratization of the Tigrayan region and people is under question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ababo, for your reflection. We'll now proceed to Mr. Zadek Abraha's reflections. Let me give you a very brief introduction about who he is. He studied public policy at the University of Oxford, and he is now the minister in charge of democratization at the Prime Minister's office. And his reflection and his speech will focus on TPLF's political activities, its background, and its formation in general. So you have 7 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. Mine will be a very brief one. I will be focusing on what TPLF has been doing for the past 3 years in flashback. So, as you are very well aware of, the federal government is undertaking a rule of operation in Tigray with a view to make Tigray an integral part of the country wherein there is a functioning rule of law. If you allow me to take you back to 3 years in flashback, nearly 3 years ago, the people of Ethiopia spoke loud and clear that they had enough of TPLF. So TPLF-led tyranny, not only TPLF, the whole tyrannical system. And some of us listened, including the Prime Minister, who resigned at that time. But the TPLF could not hear of it. The TPLF was so used to privilege that when it was asked to share power equally, it felt as if they are oppressed. So what TPLF chose is to extend its grip on power through many means, which included the non-stopping proclamation of decrees, state of emergencies, and the attempt to crack down on the social movement, which didn't work. So then the next step that TPLF did to stop the ongoing social movement was to introduce what was allegedly called the deep renewal movement, a renewal movement within the PRDF, to sabotage the call for radical reforms by introducing cosmetic changes, superficial changes, which were not going to answer the serious questions that were raised by the public. Part of the leadership within the PRDF was closely watching this constellation of events. So a group of leadership within PRDF that believes that fathomed the need for change and its inevitability arose. So EPRDF ceased to be one unified bloc. And then there is a dichotomy of APRDF, those that are that understood the need for change and that wanted to work for it, those that want to block the call for change and maintain its grip and power. So TPLF belongs to the second category. It wanted to maintain the status quo. So amidst of all this, then the Prime Minister resigned. So there arose the need for the election of a new Prime Minister, new chairman of the APRDF. Dr. Abiy Ahmed, representing the group of leadership that wanted change, came to the scene. TPLF felt threatened and it wanted to block his election as a chairman of the APRDF and then concomitantly as the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. But this became an utter failure. He won the hearts and minds of the most of the APRDF leadership, so he was able to assume both the chairmanship and the premiership, the chairmanship of the APRDF and the premiership of the nation. So when after assuming power, the Prime Minister began to take a series of reforms and changes that included the unseating of the heads of the army and national intelligence. In reaction to this, the TPLF chose to run away and caved in Mekelle. Instead of accepting this fact, instead of the measures taken by way of reform, TPLF wanted to resist it and to go back to Mekelle. So here in Mekelle, TPLF followed a three-tier approach to obstruct the popular change and reform introduced by the Abiy's administration. As you are very well aware of, the Abiy's administration introduced both change and continuity. There were things that need to be continued, the good things, and there were things that need to be changed. So it's a policy of both change and continuity. So we can call it reform. It's not a revolution, it's a reform. So then the first tier strategy designed by TPLF to obstruct the change was to make Tigray an island of resistance to change. By way of doing that, Tigray becomes TPLF gets a reducible minimum, a place where it can plan its act of obstructing the change. So Tigray was meant to serve TPLF as a safe haven to extend its plan of obstructing the change. So the first, by doing so, TPLF misled the Tigrayan elite, the Tigrayan people, that the change is against its own vested interest. While the truth is, the change might have been against the interest of finger-counted TPLF top-ranking officials. It was not against the Tigrayan people. It was not even against the interest of many of the rank and file of the TPLF. So the second tier approach it designed to resist the change was to accumulate a massive soft power. TPLF come to possess more than 12 TV channels. It tried to build an immense social media mobilization capacity at a very high cost. By doing so, TPLF will accumulate a soft power that might be able to obstruct the change. And the third tier TPLF introduced was building hard power. TPLF began to recruit special police. It also began to give training to its rank and file militias. It kind of tried to instill an army capacity which is tantamount to that of the national army. So by making Tigray an island of resistance and then building a massive amount of soft power and then all the way to building an army infrastructure, which was almost in par with the national army. TPLF wanted to come back to power, to Addis, if possible, and if that was the case, to kind of make Tigray a de facto state, joining the likes of Somaliland. And amidst this constellation of events, TPLF, understanding that the street strategy didn't bear the kind of fruit it wanted, TPLF undertook its own election, which is against the letter and the spirit of the constitution. So, by then, EPRDF, for everyone to see, was dichotomized into two groups: those that espoused the change, those that are against the change, mainly represented by the TPLF. So, amidst all this, the rest of us that wanted change, asked for apology, and the people gave us the chance to put our record straight. The TPLF adopted a different strategy, as I've talked about it. So, in introducing the change, we found out that there was some gross violation of human rights perpetrated by senior government officials that needed a serious redressing. Part of this was the case of Abdi Ile. Abdi Ile was found to have perpetrated a number of crimes, so his case is taken to a court of law. It's still being presided. And equally true, some senior-ranking TPLF officials were suspected of having violated the law of Solan. So we asked them to appear before the court of law. They refused. And since then, Tigray became an island of resistance to change, and the federal government's attempted to uphold rule of law. Generally speaking, TPLF response to the wave of reform changes we introduced can be categorized into two broad categories based on period of time. The first, which elongates itself from the appointment of the Prime Minister all the way to the formation of Bilzigana Party, wherein TPLF assumed the role of insider-outsider. The second category can also be said, it extends, it's far-fetched itself from the appointment of the Prime Minister until now. In this case, TPLF became an absolute outsider. So here you see the escalation. TPLF chose not to be part of the Bilzigana Party, so things escalated. TPLF sabotaging acts got exacerbated. In all this, the federal government showed extreme patience and continued to engage them. We sent elders as go-betweens to smooth things out and bring them back to the fold. The region got annual budgets that it never got in its history, even when they were running the show with no accountability. So our commitment to the people of Tigray never wavered. An act that was perpetrated amongst all of this, there comes the Black Tuesday. This Black Tuesday took things to the climax. It was obvious for everyone to see that we had problems with the TPLF. TPLF was engaged in a number of sabotages with a view to obstruct the change. But there was a limit to it. The Black Tuesday is different from all those things that have come and gone for the past 3 years because it crossed the red line. TPLF raided our northern military command base. It killed our soldiers. It took control of our hard-on artilleries. No government would ever tolerate this. There is a limit. No government would be patient about this. So we were forced. Then this became the final straw that broke the patience of the federal government. I would say the federal government is in this constellation. We are taking a rule of law operation. The federal government is advancing on different fronts. The military aviation against TPLF is extremely popular in this country. The operation by the federal government is legal as per the letter and the spirit of the Constitution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zadek, for your reflection. We will now proceed to Dr. Zaudane Bayana. Dr. Zaudane is a holder of doctorate degree in law, and he is also a practitioner of international law. And he's here to share us his personal reflections pertaining to some legal matters of the current situation in the Tigray region and the law enforcement mission. So the floor is yours, sir, and you have 7 minutes.
I shall be very brief. You got a very good background on historical and political counters. As a lawyer, my duty is to bring to you certain factors and help you to get a proper interpretation on that, whether any egregious, atrocious criminal acts have been committed or are being committed. In the pre-conflict situation, we all heard and know that extensive preparation were conducted. That's very important for any trained lawyer. A very simple understanding of a criminal element, the word element should be underlined. One has to know that that element, that criminal element, is a set of factors that are needed to be proven in order to determine that Mr. X or Mrs. Y has committed a crime or not. I can cite a bunch of or a list of known and nearly undisputed factors that would enable any reasonable person to conclude that serious criminal acts are being committed in the Tigray region. I'm not saying by who. I will leave that for you. First, the TPLF leadership publicly rejected the legitimacy of the federal government and labeled it unconstitutional. That is the very essence of holding of a politically divergent view, which is a direct legal repercussion in terms of interpreting the then situation and the ongoing one. That very leadership conducted unconstitutional local election and took various subsequent measures which can be easily classified as illegal. The TPLF leadership massively mobilized quote-unquote armed forces. There were large recruitments and extensive trainings were conducted to these quote-unquote armed forces. The same leadership brought the local militia and the so-called special force under one commander. That's very important. And public announcements were made by the regional officials, noting that prominent former military generals, including but not limited to the former Chief of Staff of Ethiopia, were put in charge of planning and training these local forces. More so, the TPLF leadership conducted several military parades and broadcasted them publicly to the Ethiopian public and the international community at large. There were extensive exchange of saber rattlings. It has a very serious connotation under the laws of war. Massive anti-government media propaganda, making public oral support and allegedly conducting clandestine financial and training supporters to banditry armed groups operating in various localities of the country. And this same leadership made a public call to all nationalities to overthrow the incumbent, the federal government. As if this is not enough, the TPLF leadership attacked the National Defense Forces, in particular to the Northern Command. And it has confiscated heavy artillery, including long-distance hitting rockets and missiles. This has been admitted by the TPLF leadership publicly. These are factors on the ground in the pre-conflict situation. Now I'll take you back to the 101 of Ethiopian criminal law. The set of factors I just outlined helps anyone to classify them at least in 4 categories. Number 1, was there an intent to attack, to overthrow the government, to inflict damage and pains on the citizens? The answer is yes. So one element is fulfilled, what we call it mens rea, the intent of the perpetrator. Number 2, have these acts which I just listed actually occurred? The answer is yes. And the third question is, was there any relationship between what was intended and what has been committed? Again, the answer is yes. The Ethiopian law fully, and I can tell that 100%, fully in compliance with the international legal standards. Historians tell us that right after the Second World War, when the Nuremberg Tribunal was established, Ethiopia was very active in that discussion, and it was very simple, handy for Ethiopia to incorporate all those international standards in its domestic law, because the then Penal Code of Ethiopia came right after that event. And Ethiopia has extensive experience in applying those laws domestically without resorting to international fora. All this should not confuse anyone in this hall. the conflict we are talking about is not an international armed conflict. It is 100% a local or a domestic or an internal armed conflict. A friend of me the other day asked me that I'm totally lost and confused how to call this incident, what's happening in Ethiopia. So I gave my own interpretation to that. Probably it's very much helpful to many of us in this hall. For me, it is a large-scale law enforcement operation that led to an armed conflict. I'll repeat. This is a large-scale law enforcement operation that led to an armed conflict. Giving that context, now I will take you that what law governs the current situation, circumstance in Ethiopia. As I said, the Ethiopian law is very rich, and it encompasses everything that one could incite from international legal instruments. That said, both the domestic and international legal instruments in regulating war, quote unquote, the following principles need to be always abided by. The combatants should always hit a target of military necessity, period. This is very important. Military necessity, you can hit that military necessity if you are in a war situation. But at the same time, you are obligated to take care of the civilians, which we call it the principle of humanity. The balance between two can easily be clarified by upholding of the third principle, which is called proportionality. Military necessity, humanity, and proportionality. These three concepts are very essential to reach out any reasonable judgment by any lay person. Throughout the pendency of an armed conflict, leaders and combatants are trained or should be trained to know the balance between these three principles. The other utmost important point I need to flag here is every participant in armed conflict has individual responsibility. This is very important to underline. And the other point, I know it has taken some time for the media and for the layperson on the street to discuss about who initiated the war, quote unquote. War initiation is so relevant when the war is conducted between two equals, between two sovereigns. In our case, this question is irrelevant. Why? The incumbent, the local government, is duty-bound to enforce its own law anytime when it wants, but within the framework of the permitted laws. I heard one of the leaders on TV saying that we are acting in self-defense, quote unquote, and even he gave a theory to it. This is anticipatory self-defense. As I said, in fact, the Ethiopian government is criticized because of its neglect of duty for years, not to timely act. That's the way I understand it. Probably would have not reached to the level where we are today. We would have not confused the Ethiopian public and the international community at large by letting this thing to happen. So, extreme and unproportional patience given by the federal government has led us to the situation where we are today. In fact, one could take his good lawyer and challenge the federal government because of its neglect of duty. That law enforcement action should happen any moment. It should not let to happen very late, where the casualties and consequences of this battle has led us to a situation where it is very painful. I could give you a bunch of provisions and articles from the Ethiopian Criminal Code. Probably I can cite some of them for your personal reference. Very clearly articulated in no ambiguous terms. What's happening in the Tigray region can be easily labeled as atrocious criminal acts. The Ethiopian Criminal Code, under Article 248, qualifies what has happened in the Tigray region and what has been committed by the TPLF leadership as treason. Article 248. Article 288. It explains about desertion that has happened. Article 298, insubordination. And mutiny, Article 299. In fact, I encourage you to pick the Ethiopian Criminal Code and look into the full book. It's called Books 3. Crimes committed against the nation, against the state, against humanity, and so forth. Most of those provisions are easily applicable in the situation we are in today. And one quick point, what should happen in the post-conflict situation in terms of exercising post-conflict justice? As a lawyer, no to impunity is my final message. This government has been dragged to unwanted war because it wanted to enforce its own law by saying no to impunity. Yes, we are suffering, it's so painful, but the coming generation should not see anymore such irresponsible acts. That can be done only when accountability and justice can be seen in one prison, and when any self-loving regime finally says no to impunity. This is the way I understand why the federal government of Ethiopia is taking arms to put law and order in a region where lawlessness has prevailed. If no action is taken, it will be worse, not only for Ethiopia, for the entire sub-region and the continent at large.